I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event on U.S. foreign policy, specifically Donald Trump's plan to kill the Iran nuclear agreement, a conversation between Ambassador Christopher Hill and Trita Parsi. It's both an honor and a pleasure to host Trita Parsi again here at the Josef Korbel School. 5 years ago, when our Center for Middle East Studies began, we actually started off with an event called Can War with Iran Be Averted?, featuring both Ambassador Hill, Trita Parsi, and the former dean of the Korbel School, Tom Fair, and the former governor of Colorado, Richard Lamb. And 5 years later, here we are again, dealing with the same basic topic, the same set of questions, but with one crucial difference, that Donald Trump is now in the White House. As you all know, we're fast approaching this deadline where the President of the United States has to make a decision as to whether he's going to certify the Iran nuclear agreement or abandon it. Along with the simmering crisis with North Korea, the status of the Iran nuclear agreement now ranks at the top of the U.S. national security agenda and will likely dominate the news as we approach the October 15th deadline. There are all of these conflicting reports as to what might happen. You hear reports that Trump is going to kill the deal, then you hear reports that he's going to sort of kill the deal but then try and not ask Congress to ratify sanctions, which would then be the formal death of the deal. So there's a lot of confusing and moving parts here. And to try and make sense of where things stand today, where we're headed, what the lessons of history are and the lessons of diplomacy, is someone who I think is really an expert in the field. He's made an important contribution to the national debate on this topic, and that's our keynote guest and speaker, Trita Parsi. Trita has a PhD in international relations from Johns Hopkins University, where he studied with both Francis Fukuyama and the late Zbigniew Brzezinski. He's been a very prominent and principled voice in the national foreign policy debate. In terms of his formal resume, Trita is the author of 3 important books. In 2010, he was the recipient of a $200,000 Graumayer Award for ideas on improving world order. And that largely had to do with the publication of his books. The first one being Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the U.S., which won the Graumayer Award and the Council on Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Book Award. His second book, A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, was selected as the best book on the Middle East in 2012 by Foreign Affairs. And his latest book, just published, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, reveals the behind-the-scenes story to the historic nuclear deal with Iran. All 3 have been published by Yale University Press. And that really gives Trita, I think, credentials to speak on this topic that are really matched by no one else that I can think of writing and commenting on these issues today. This is someone who knows the topic inside and out. He's currently the president of the largest Iranian-American grassroots organization in the U.S., the National Iranian-American Council. He's taught at Johns Hopkins and George Washington, and he currently teaches at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., one of our competitors, but we're not going to hold that against Trita. The format today is a conversation between Chris Hill and Trita Parsi. They'll go for maybe, 30, 40 minutes. Then we'll have time for questions and answers. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming back to the Korbel School, Trita Parsi.
Maybe I'll just say a word and first of all, I'm very sorry to have been a few minutes late, but I was downtown and they had asked me, one of the national networks asked me to discuss the fact that our Secretary of State called a press conference today to deal with whether or not he actually called the president a moron or not. I'd never done that before, so it was kind of news. It was new stuff for me, Did he really call him a moron? The issue continues because the secretary did not say yes or no. So in the parlance of the media, he did not deny it. So it's such a pleasure to get back to a nice, friendly issue like the Iran nuclear question. And Trita, I look forward to your comments, but any and all comments you can make in the time that we have. But I think maybe it might be useful for the audience to understand how does the mechanism of this so-called certifying of the agreement, because it seems that it's a built-in crisis every, what is it, 2 months or 3 months?
Every 3 months.
Every 3 months we have a sort of built-in cliffhanger, sort of stay tuned till next week. Maybe people who like reality TV might like this kind of thing, but for the rest of us who would like a more stable platform on which to proceed and try to deal with these hellacious issues, especially the North Korean nuclear issue right now, I think we'd like to see a little more stability and a little more smoothness as we go forward. So over to you, Trita.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here again. It's a great, great pleasure. Thank you all for coming. You really put your finger on something really important, because we call it certification, people are left with the impression as to whether the U.S. is the judge as to whether Iran is living up to the agreement or not.
And jury, too.
And jury,
yeah.
Which is not the case. The referee in this is the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has issued 8 reports by now certifying that the Iranians are in compliance. But because Congress wanted to have a role in this, and this was actually a fight not necessarily as much between the Republicans and Obama, this was an issue between Senator Tim Kaine and Obama, a Democrat, a close ally of Obama, who felt very strongly that there needed to be an orderly process in which Congress can have a say on this, and then to have the oversight role that Congress arguably should have on issues of this kind. So a law was put into place called the INARA, in which every 90 days, the president has to certify to Congress that Iran is living up to the agreement. But there's one added component, which is very, very problematic. The 2 first components essentially is, are the Iranians living up to the nuclear part of the deal? The third one is to have the president certify to Congress that it continues to lie in the national interest of the United States to continue to waive sanctions on Iran. Now, see what this means. It's no longer about the nuclear issue. It's about the broader U.S. national interests and all of the different issues that has to do with Iran, which were not part of the nuclear deal. So the congressional certification process actually goes way beyond the nuclear deal. And that's where the administration, who doesn't like the deal for reasons that I don't think they really have managed to explain, perhaps they can't explain it to themselves, but nevertheless, they're seeing it as an opening to be able to say, okay, perhaps the deal is working. I mean, Tillerson has said that publicly. The Iranians are in compliance. Mattis said yesterday pretty much the same thing. Dunford has said that the Iranians are in compliance. But if we also have the opportunity to decertify based on the fact that Iran has not turned into Switzerland as a result of the deal, that's something that the Trump administration is trying to utilize. And to be fair to Senator Kaine and Corker, I don't think they ever foresaw that that clause would be used in this way that it is right now.
But isn't it fair to say, because I've negotiated on issues like this, and then you come back to Washington and you say, okay, this is what we got. And Washington would say, why did you agree to this? And of course, you don't just agree to it. There's an interplay with Secretary of State or whoever is dealing with it. And then finally, you basically have to explain that, I wasn't negotiating with air. I was negotiating with another party. And with respect to the Iran issue, the other party was saying, we're not going to be able to sell this nuclear deal until we get this break on sanctions. That if we come back from the nuclear deal and still have the panoply of sanctions, which do stem from broader issues than the nuclear issue, we can't sell it. And so I think what happened, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it, Trita, I think the British, the American, the German, the French, the Russian, the Chinese delegations felt it was worth going forward, provided we could give the sanctions relief.
Absolutely, but I think it goes a little bit beyond that. The sanctions that the other countries have imposed on Iran were based on the nuclear issue. It is not based on them agreeing with the United States on the status of Hezbollah, for instance, which the Europeans have not put. And they make a distinction between Hezbollah's military and political arm. The United States does not. So all of the other sanctions were strictly nuclear. Many of the primary American sanctions, the ones that target American companies if they dare to do trade with Iran, have a foreign policy route that is divided between the nuclear issue, support for terrorism, opposition to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, which hasn't been in real existence for the last decade anyways, as well as involvement in terrorism. But the sanctions that have been put into place by the US government since 2009 or so were explicit on the nuclear issue, and the US only lifted or waived those sanctions. All of the other sanctions, the Iran, Libya Sanctions Act, which is now just the Iran Sanctions Act, was based on other things, and that was actually renewed last year. So those have been kept in place. But this comes to the larger issue of why did we just focus on the nuclear issue?
Why a narrow deal?
Exactly. Why did we not turn Iran into Switzerland and make sure that everything was just amazing over there as a result of this deal? Well, it has many different roots. One of it is the Obama administration recognized that however powerful the United States is, it's not going to be able to truly be able to put pressure on the Iranians unless it has a completely unified P5+1. Back in the days when you were involved in it, I'm sure you remember that the Iranians were quite good at playing the United States against the Russians, the Europeans against the Chinese, etc., and splitting the P5+1. In order to limit the issue to something that all P5+1 members could actually agree on, it had to be the nuclear issue. If it had been expanded to also include Syria, for instance, a very pressing regional issue, well, the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese are much closer to the Iranian position on Syria than they are to the American position on Syria. So you would not have had a unified P5 vis-a-vis the Iranians if the agenda had been expanded. Initially, the Iranians wanted to have a very, very broad agenda. They wanted to address climate change as part of this as well. And the US saw that as just a ploy to actually waste time and that they were not serious about it. But there's also another aspect here I think is very important. The very same countries that now are complaining that the nuclear deal did not do anything about the regional aspect were also countries that at the time were pressing the United States very, very hard not to address the regional issues. The Saudis made it very clear to the United States that they did not want to see the United States and Iran talk about regional issues if the Saudis are not in the room. They did not want that. They did not want to see the United States make concessions on regional issues, whether it's Lebanon or Iraq, in order to get nuclear concessions from the Iranians. Same thing with the Israelis. In fact, for the Israeli perspective, they zeroed in on the nuclear issue because they thought that's the most difficult issue to resolve. It would maximize the chances of the talks failing. So they wanted the negotiations to only be on the nuclear issue for that reason. Now they're singing a different tune and they're complaining that the regional aspects have not been addressed, but that's partly because they demanded of the United States that it shouldn't be addressed.
Yeah. And essentially, I mean, to understand these negotiations, you know, the U.S. would talk to its NATO partners, the British and the French, and they'd try to have a common position, and they try to sell the Russians and the Chinese, who, by the way, often got together on those issues as well. So I think it often happens in multilateral diplomacy, and this was multilateral. I think one of the problems in the reporting of the issue in the United States is it looks like a nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran. It's very multilateral, but one of the problems has been you do go to a least common denominator if you can't agree on what we really want the Iranians to do with Hezbollah or the Bashar al-Assad regime. You go, okay, let's pull that out and do that at another time. In the meantime, let's try to get at the issue that I think is most destabilizing. And we can talk some more about that.
And remember also that Iran's support for Hezbollah or even the Assad regime has not been defined by anyone as an existential threat. Right. The nuclear issue was defined by Benjamin Netanyahu extensively as an existential threat, and it was the issue that could have brought about a major military confrontation. So from their own metric, that was the issue that had to take precedence over everything else.
But let's, you touched upon the Saudi issue, and by the way, I think that's, the Saudis were up to their eyeballs in Syria, still are in certain respects. And so, but let's talk about the sort of deeper issue, and I think it has had a real effect on President Trump's view of this, which is Saudi Arabia. I think you would agree with me. They've kind of forgiven America for supporting Israel. They're kind of moved on. They've never forgiven us for invading Iraq, toppling a Sunni-led regime, and in effect, because the political identity, unfortunately, is sectarian, whether we like it or not, it was a fact, Shia voted for Shia and Sunni voted for Sunni. So they've never really forgiven us for creating a large Shia-led country on their border that inevitably has a better relationship with Iran than it did as a Sunni-led country. And then they see us mixing it up with the Iranians, and it's kind of reminiscent of the Iranian relationship with the U.S. in the 70s. And so they see us with this old dance partner again, and they're sort of wondering, Americans, we see you're going back to Iran. And of course, our reaction was saying, oh, please, this is a completely different world, and we'll sell you some more F-15s. That's sort of a solution to every problem. Usually works. And if you want to bomb Yemen, go for it. That'll help too. But ultimately, we've never kind of repaired the Saudi relationship caused by the invasion of Iraq.
I think that's a fair assessment, but I would also add that I think they have put the bar somewhere that actually makes it irreparable.
Okay.
And the reason is this.
The Saudis have.
Yes. Yeah. Because look, if you listen carefully to what Adel Jubeir, the Saudi foreign minister, says, he says that the Iranians are trying to upend the regional order. What regional order? Reality is this. There was an order in the region. It was based on the centrality of Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, an American-led order, Pax Americana. It was called dual containment. It was based on the exclusion of Iran and Iraq. The Iranians hated it. They did everything they could to cause its collapse, but they were not the ones who did cause its collapse. It was the United States itself by going into Iraq in 2003. That was done because it was a recognition that that degree of American hegemony simply was too costly. Being on the opposite side of both Iran and Iraq, two of the most powerful states in the region, was a pretty expensive endeavor. If you take out those regimes, you can actually prolong American control over the region or dominance over the region without that high expense. I mean, this is, of course, based on the assumption that the war would have been the cakewalk it was promised to be. What happened was that the United States managed to cause the collapse of the old order without being in a position to replace it with a new order. The United States has been weakened to the extent that it no longer has the capacity to impose on the Middle East a new equilibrium. The Saudis and the Israelis were the biggest losers of this. They enjoyed maximum maneuverability in the region under the protection of the United States, while the US was handling the main challenger to them, which was Iran, the most potent challenger to them. This collapsed in 2003. Ever since, the region essentially has been orderless. That's why we see so much instability right now. We are in that transition mode between one balance to the next. We don't know when the next will emerge, but it's that transition that by definition is the most unstable periods in a system's lifespan. The Saudis want, and they've made this clear, to go back to the pre-2003 order. I think that is an understandable position if you're in Riyadh. But that essentially means that one out of two things need to happen. Either America turns Iraq and Afghanistan to amazing successes that once again can balance Iran from the east and from the west, clearly not in the cards, or you cut down Iran in size, which is what they push for, a military confrontation that would reduce Iran's power, which in and of itself then would balance things again. That did not happen. Instead, what happened, that the Obama administration decided that because there wasn't a diplomatic opportunity, and because this issue had been defined as existential, which meant that it was not possible for the Obama administration to kick the can down the road, they would lead to war if it wasn't resolved. By that, by definition of striking a deal with Iran, it put an end to 37 years of American policy of seeking Iran's all-out containment and isolation in the region. And it recognized that Iran is a major power in the region, that despite the many, many differences that the United States has with it, we have to work with them one way or another to be able to find some sort of a modus operandi. That's why when Obama said to the Saudis, innocently in his mind, that Saudi Arabia needs to find a way to learn how to share the region with Iran, this was a great offense to the Saudis, because it essentially meant America is no longer going to be the instrument that you can use to seek Iran's all-out isolation and fight the Iranians to the last American. It no longer lies in our interest. We don't believe it lies in your interest. And ultimately, Saudi Arabia cannot wish away Iran. Iran cannot wish away Saudi Arabia. So we have to, through dialogue, find a way to make you guys get along. This is the ultimate betrayal beyond Iraq. Iraq is the first step. It's the fact that the United States says, you know what, after 15, 20 years of promising to contain Iran, we don't think it's working any longer. We have to find a way to compromise. You also have to compromise. And this is what the Saudis so vehemently opposed. When the Israelis were pushing the Obama administration, they actually had arguments. They had arguments about, you know, have lesser amount of centrifuges. They obviously know a nuclear program quite well, having more than 200 nuclear weapons themselves. The Saudis never came in and said, look, we don't like this proposal you're discussing with the Iranians right now because you're giving them too much centrifuges, you're not hard enough on research, etc. Their argument, how can you possibly negotiate and make a deal with this government? End of story.
Yeah. Let me ask you, because soon after, and even during the negotiations, and the press became kind of fascinated by this, Secretary Kerry, it seemed, even during the negotiations, had kind of struck up a kind of special relationship with, by the way, our own graduate, MA and PhD graduate, Javad Zarif.
You guys are to blame.
And we're, you know, when they say Zarif was Western educated, they're not kidding. I mean, right here in Denver. But anyway, it was clear that Kerry was interested in pursuing things with Zarif. He saw in Zarif someone who was prepared to look at the broader issue beyond just the nuclear issue. So my question is, in pursuing this kind of relationship with Zarif, did he kind of cause this anxiety, which you describe in, I think, very accurate systemic terms, this anxiety in Saudi Arabia? Did he turn this anxiety into out-and-out paranoia and lay some of the seeds for what we're dealing with right now? Should he have just said, Javad, I love you, I love the University of Denver, but we can't talk now because this is going to make this problem even worse?
I have to be frank, and my answer is no, because John Kerry is the Secretary of State of the United States, not the Secretary of State of Saudi Arabia or Israel. And as a result, there was an opportunity to resolve an issue that had been defined as existential, that could have led to a massive war between the United States and Iran. It was a solution they had found that should have actually put the concerns of Israel and Saudi Arabia to rest when they were complaining about the nuclear issue. I don't think there was anything they could have done, to be frank with you, because the ultimate objective of the Israelis and the Saudis was to not have a deal at all. And not having a deal at all meant that the United States at some point would end up having to take military action or accept Iran becoming a nuclear power. This is the impossible position that pressure had put the United States in. I think actually the administration did quite a lot to try to alleviate their fears. You mentioned one of them. The United States did not take a harsh position against Saudi's war in Yemen, in fact provided political support for it, precisely because they feared that if they didn't, it would just further vindicate in the minds of the Saudis that, oh my God, Saudi Arabia, the United States is actually trying to become an Iranian ally in the region. As you know, within the US government, there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for what Saudi Arabia ended up doing in Yemen, and it still isn't. But there was a feeling that under these circumstances, with these negotiations with Iran, in which the Saudis believe that the US is going to throw them under the bus, if then on this issue that the Saudis had defined as an Iranian provocation in Yemen, if the US didn't fully back the Saudis, it would just further strengthen their view. So instead, the U.S. did back them.
Yeah. Another question, as the Americans and even those who want to certify go forward, there's a tendency to really vilify the Iranians as if to say, hey, we're not naive about the Iranians. So there's a sort of vilifying of the Iranians in the hopes that that will then lead the way to certification, because after all, they're going in with their eyes wide open. They know how terrible this country is, and so if they suggest certifying, it's not because they're naive, they just feel that in that narrow. So I guess my question is, does that kind of strategy work, or when people hear all about Iran's misbehavior, and there is misbehavior, do they then say, well, how can you then trust them on the nuclear issue?
So you really phrased it quite well. Within the administration, in order to be able to convince the president to do something he really doesn't like doing, which is to certify that Obama's deal is working, you have to give him something else, really aggressive, so that he can claim, rightly or falsely, that he is at least trying to live up to some aspect of his promises to his base. There's two major problems with this, which is that at the end of the day, in order for this deal to work out, in my analysis at least, it necessitated a slightly positive trajectory in U.S.-Iran relations on these other issues. Not to say that the U.S. should be caving into Iran's position, but that we actually did need to start dealing with those issues, finding solutions to them, partly because of their own value and partly because it was necessary to make sure that those issues were resolved so that they wouldn't become a threat to an even more important issue, which was to make sure that Iran did not get nuclear weapons. If you then now come with a suggestion, you know what, let's take the trajectory massively negative in order not to decertify, I fear that that actually will become a Pyrrhic victory for the supporters of the nuclear deal. Yes, perhaps there isn't decertification this time around, but let's see what happens by January 15. What happens by March 15? If we're going to be in this perpetual state of crisis, which we're already in by virtue of what happened in November, but if we're going to be in this state of perpetual crisis over the Iran issue, that in and of itself is enough to kill the deal, I fear. Mm-hmm. Then there is another aspect, which is, in the course of the last 37 years, there's really only one example in which the United States has managed to, in a significant way, change Iran's policies. And that's on this nuclear issue as a result of negotiations in which there was a genuine give and take. The Iranians gave, but the Iranians also got stuff because the US also made concessions. That's the only example we have in which we have been successful. Now, instead of then using that model to be able to address the very serious and real concerns that exist about Iran's policies in Iraq, Syria in particular, Hezbollah, etc., we're going back to the model that has produced absolutely nothing for the last 37 years. Mm-hmm. That's the problem in my mind, which is that we're so path dependent, that we're so addicted to our pressure policies and our desire to look tough, that we're willing to go down that route instead of going down a proven path that has produced results.
You know, Nader's given us like 35 minutes, so we really ought to turn to questions, but I'd like to at least get a general comment from you. I realize you've probably written a book on this subject, but I think of Iran today as a deeply divided society. It's not as bad as Democrats and Republicans, but it does have attributes of rural, urban, secular, sectarian, I mean, all kinds of issues that are really causing a tremendous strain on the ability to have consensus foreign policy. For example, I'm sure if you ask an Iranian engineer in Tehran what he thinks of southern Lebanon, he would say, I have no interest in southern Lebanon. But I'll bet if you ask a cleric in Qom, he would say, well, those clerics in southern Lebanon, they're the ones who came over at the invitation of Shah Ismail in 1502 and helped make us Shia, and how could we ever forsake them now? So I guess my question is this deeply divided Iranian society part of the problem in our inability to kind of deal with this state in a more constructive and frankly long-term way?
Some of the things you said I think is absolutely correct, but I still do not agree with the premise of the question, which is that our difficulty in dealing with Iran has been because of them being divided. On the nuclear issue, they got an elite foreign policy consensus in favor of the deal. Those who opposed it were quiet. Yeah. Their discipline there, frankly, was much stronger than ours. It wasn't 100 or plus Iranian parliamentarians who wrote a letter to the President of the United States saying, don't mind striking a deal with Rouhani because we're going to undo that deal as soon as he's unelected. Instead, it was, what was it, 100, how many was 45 American senators or something like that who wrote that letter to the Iranian supreme leader in the midst of the negotiations. The Iranians being divided definitely has created problems in other examples. Certainly during the Iran-Contra scandal, that was a very, very important factor. I agree with that. You're quite correct. But I think, frankly, the main, if I were to identify one factor more important than anyone else, is and we see that very clearly right now, is because we are overestimating our power and we are underestimating Iran's power, and as a result, our expectation of what a negotiation outcome should be is essentially a variation of some form of Iranian capitulation. That's why we have people claiming, you know, how come the deal is not permanent? How come they are keeping X amount of centrifuge? How come all of these things were not achieved? Well, they're not achieved because they were unachievable. It's simple as that. And in order to get a deal, you needed to have a president like Obama, and perhaps even more importantly, a Secretary of State like Kerry that truly was committed to diplomacy, who played a critical, and I write extensively about it in the book, the role that Kerry played in getting the secret channel up and running in Oman, which was actually the essential element of the deal that paved the way for it. And it was in those negotiations, incidentally, back when Ahmadinejad was president, that the United States made its first and most important concession to the Iranians, which was to accept that Iran is going to keep enrichment, granted, of course, that the Iranians agreed to a significant amount of limitations and inspections. That was the strongest negotiation bargaining card that the US had, and it was played in those secret negotiations even before Rouhani came in. Had that not been played, we would still be in a crisis right now. Had that been played 10 years earlier or 5 years earlier, we likely would have gotten a better deal than the one we got now, because the Iranians would not have advanced as much and not built as many centrifuges, not gotten such a high stockpile of LEU, not learned so much about the nuclear process. But the combination of a very exaggerated assessment of what we can achieve and a refusal to really offer anything in return is what caused us to lose so much time, which actually over time in comparison, comparatively gave the Iranians more leverage than the US.
I think maybe we should go to questions from the audience, because I've left about, I think, 15 minutes for that. But one of the great things here at the University of Denver at Korbel is we have all kinds of expertise. You mentioned Oman, but we have the former ambassador to Oman here, Gary Grappo. And Gary, I wonder if you might want to ask a question about sort of the put you on the spot about either Oman or maybe more broadly about this issue of the Arab-Iranian relations, and has that issue put us in a position of having to choose, which one never likes to do in foreign policy, or anything else you want to ask, Ambassador Grappo? So, yeah, yeah, you can. Yeah,
You guys,
yeah,
it is true that had it not been for the good offices of Oman, a country with whom we've had a very strong relationship going back to the early 1980s, we were able to finally have an impact on Tehran. I mean, it was an open issue between us and the Omanis about how to deal with Iran, and even sometimes when we didn't ask them, they they would carry the water for us. Largely because of all of our allies, they had the best relationship in the Arab world with the Iranians, and that resonated all the way up to the Sultan, who often would come back and brief us about his conversations. Yeah, they played an indispensable role, and as you said, I don't think it could have worked without the Sultan. I wanted to ask you something that I just read recently, and I have not heard much about, and that is, again, the Iranians, the foreign minister, Zarif, has recently traveled to Muscat, capital, and is delivering a proposal, apparently, to the administration on not necessarily modifications, but amplifications of the nuclear accord. Now, as you said, there will be things in there that they might be willing to concede, but they're going to ask us for concessions as well. So my question is twofold. Do you know anything more about this? And secondly, what might we expect in this proposal? And is it perhaps a vindication of this hardline approach that Trump has been taking, where now that the Iranians are coming to us saying, okay, yeah, we're willing to talk about it again.
Thank you so much. Before I go into your question, if I could, since you mentioned the Sultan, I want to reveal a passage in the book that I think you might find interesting. That really shows the tremendous role that the Sultan played in all of this. In the March 2013 secret meeting in Oman, that's when the president had realized that the sanctions track has really hurt the Iranians, but the sanctions clock was not ticking as fast as the nuclear clock. So unless something major changed, the United States would be faced with either going to war or accepting Iran as a nuclear power. The thing that could change was if we tried playing the enrichment card. So he sent a very senior delegation, which included Bill Burns, the #2 at the State Department. And in a very carefully crafted formulation, the US side made clear to the Iranians how they would be able to accept enrichment in Iran, under what circumstances. And this is what the Iranians have been looking for more than 10 years. This was their absolute bottom line. But despite the fact that they moved closer to each other on this issue of substance, the mistrust between the two countries was still so deep that there actually wasn't a real breakthrough. The Iranians couldn't go back to Tehran just with an oral promise that the Americans are actually going to accept enrichment. That wouldn't work. And at the same time, the American side was absolutely forbidden from putting this in writing because of many different reasons. One, the Iranians could potentially pocket the concession without giving anything in return, but perhaps mainly because this was the main concession. It was supposed to be played with the United States and the Europeans in tandem in the official P5 negotiations, not in secret. The Europeans didn't even know about this until 6 months later. If it was put in writing, it could leak. It could create disaster for the very careful unity Obama had managed to create in the P5+1. So once again, the Omanis step in. Who in this planet has the capacity of having both the trust of the United States and the supreme leader of Iran? Who's their shared common Facebook friend? Well, essentially probably only the Sultan. So the idea emerged that if the United States cannot put this in writing to the Iranians, the United States can put this in writing to the Sultan. The Sultan would then, in between his chemotherapy, travel to Iran, sit down face to face with the supreme leader of Iran, not show him the letter, but convey to him the contents of that letter. If the Iranians then reject it, it wouldn't be because of their established and very real mistrust of the US, but it would actually be them expressing mistrust of the Sultan, which they couldn't do because they actually hold him in very high esteem. And that's how this got resolved. So in this era of Sunni-Shia tensions, Arab-Persian tensions, even though, of course, the Omanis are not majority Sunni, it was an Arab country that brought the United States and Iran closer together on this issue. It's important to keep in mind. On this news story that there is potentially a new proposal, if I'm not mistaken, the source of that is Amir Tahiri, who is not a credible source on this. I very much doubt that there's any truth in that, and I'll tell you Why? Beyond the fact that the Iranians, the only way this could be opened up is if we're asking the Iranians to put more on the table, that could only happen if Trump puts more on the table. And his idea is that there is no table. So I don't see any opening there at all. But to further give an example as to why I find that story very non-credible, when Trump went to Riyadh, his first foreign trip, which didn't go to Canada or Mexico, but instead went to Riyadh, he had meetings with every GCC leader scheduled.
Gulf Cooperation
Gulf
Council.
Cooperation country, you know, there's Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Oman. And he last minute canceled the meeting with the Sultan as a deliberate snub. And it was later communicated to the Sultan that this was to convey Trump's displeasure with the role that the Sultan played in getting the nuclear deal. So the idea that the Sultanis now would have a capacity to be able to play this role, I find not very, I mean, a lot needs to change before that could happen again.
Okay, next question. Listen. If you can wait for the microphone.
I will. Thank you. Yeah, I have a question that I think Ambassador Korbel might want to ask. The certification itself, it seems as if, I mean, in my mind, that was just what it was, certification. You looked at this list of things and you say yes, no, and this is the conclusion of that. It seems like that has turned into a renegotiation process. I mean, in your remarks, you talked about what Trump might bring to the table, what Iran might bring to the table. I guess the question is that in fact what is happening? And how can we possibly live with the idea of this happening every quarter?
Well, we can possibly imagine that happening if our foreign policy is run by someone who used to do real estate development in Manhattan, in which this actually is a very effective tactic. Perhaps this is the way that you negotiate with your subcontractors and you get a better deal. But neither Iran nor any other country in the P5+1 are subcontractors of the United States. This doesn't work this way, and you know, Chris would know this better than anyone else, having dealt extensively with them. So we do have that issue. And I think you're quite right. It is turning this into a continuous renegotiation, which in and of itself undermines the deal. See, part of what I think actually is very deliberately done right now, because when you hear administration officials say, I have no idea what the president is going to do. He can do this, but he could also do the exact opposite. I think those are actually very deliberate statements because it infuses maximum uncertainty into the situation. What does the uncertainty do? Well, it leads to a scenario in which the companies, international companies, mainly European and Asian companies, who were waiting for this deal and were waiting to see Trump commit himself to the deal, once that's done, they would enter the Iranian market. That would be part of the financial benefit the Iranians would get for living up to the deal. Well, there is no certainty now because they're constantly saying, well, we may just kill the deal tomorrow. We have no idea what the president is going to do. He tells Theresa May of the UK that he has made up his mind of what he's going to do, but I won't tell you. And we're not talking about, you know, him speaking to a potential rival of the United States. We're talking about the United Kingdom, a party to the deal. So I think there is an element here in which they're deliberately trying to create so much uncertainty so that businesses don't end up going into Iran, which to a very large extent has happened, which then eventually will lead to a scenario in which the Iranians are going to ask themselves, what's the benefit of being in compliance when none of that economic benefit is coming as a direct result of the U.S. creating so much uncertainty? And at that moment,
that
Iran...
was the basis of all the hope.
Yes.
That somehow this would happen and grow into a relationship that had more depth. And yes, as you described, that can't happen in this environment.
Yeah.
Okay. John.
So I think the telegraph messages appear to be that he'll certify that they're in compliance with the JCPOA, but we need to look at a broader palette of what the Iranians are doing in the region and where our interests align non-aligned, and that we have a responsibility to take action where we see the Iranians causing problems, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Syria, etc., Shia militias in Iraq. And because we've signed the JCPOA, it seems to be that we're confusing that we do have a role to play in the balance of power in the region and how it plays out. Is this theory that because we've signed the JCPOA, we're restricted now from taking actions like limited sanctions because of missile development, or because of acting out to support Assad in Syria, or creating a non-nation state actor that overtakes the state of Lebanon, which are all happening in large part because of Iranian influence.
And could you spell out
So
JCPOA?
Outside of the multilateral JCPOA, should we not be looking as a nation at how we can influence Iran and raise the cost of their pernicious influence?
Sure.
Absolutely, it's a great question. And just so everyone heard, JCPOA, that's a Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that's the nuclear deal. I don't think it is correct that the United States cannot target some of those policies, because there's plenty of sanctions the US could pursue that are outside of the nuclear field that would not be in violation of that deal. What the US cannot do is to start targeting the general trade that Iran has right now. But it can target individuals, it can put individuals and companies on lists, etc. That is completely possible. But I think the broader issue is this. In order to address that set of policies that the United States has a problem with, it really is difficult to do so if we are at the same time not addressing the many other factors that are also creating or contributing to these problems. Saudi Arabia is not an angel in the region. Iran is not the only country that is contributing to problems in Syria, for instance, or elsewhere. Only addressing the Iranian aspect eventually will not lead to a solution at all. The only way to do so is actually be able to get all the parties to the table. And that's actually the promise that the nuclear deal provided. Immediately after the deal was struck, even before the deal was struck, Mogherini started having the conversations with the others to make sure that the next meeting on Syria in Geneva, Iran would be included, and that would be a 180-degree shift of the US position, because the US prior to that continued to have the containment policy of not including Iran in this. Obama had to call King Abdullah himself and say, don't you dare call in sick, because you're gonna have to show up. We know you don't want to go in there when the Iranians are there, but we're gonna have to do this now. Unfortunately, it didn't lead to a scenario because that process was prematurely abandoned in some ways, and even some of the progress that was made was reversed. But ultimately, that is what's going to have to happen. If we want to see a true resolution in Iraq, which is beyond just what the Iranians are doing, or in Syria, then we have to bring everyone to the table. And that's what the JCPOA, that's where the restriction is for those who oppose the JCPOA, because they don't want that. The JCPOA is not restricting the United States to be able to be tough on Iran on some of these issues, but the JCPOA is restricting the United States from going back to an all-out containment policy. And that's what the problem lies for some of those. It's not about having some targeted sanctions against Iran, pushing back. It's about not accepting that Iran is a player in the region that we have to deal with.
So we're going to go to the fateful last question. So maybe this gentleman in the way back there.
Yeah. Question actually on the future of the GCC as a security organization, as the majority of the GCC members are now gravitating towards Iran. What role will they have? And then just a brief comment on the Israel endgame. Assuming that the Iran, Russia, and now Turkey axis is going to be victorious in Syria. Victor Lieberman yesterday came out and has asked for greater engagement of the United States in the Middle East. If that's the case, what can be done?
On the first question, one of the things that we have to recognize now is that there's been some fundamental changes in the region, and one of the most important ones is that there is now one country that actually has good relations with all of the major countries in the Middle East and is in a track of improving its relations with all of those countries, and that's Russia. Russia's role in the Middle East now is going to be significantly greater than what it has been in the last 2 decades. This is part of the reason why the Saudi king is going to Russia. I think it's next week, why the Israelis are paying a lot of attention to Russia now, and also why they're asking the United States to come back in and have a stronger role in the region. This is going to be one of the defining characteristics of the Middle East going forward. And I think it's going to make it all the more important to approach the region in a more holistic way. If we're just focusing on the problems that the Iranians are putting in front of us, we're missing the much, much larger picture that is happening. And that's ultimately going to undermine U.S. interest. Now, when it comes to the question to the GCC, I think you said that they're gravitating towards Iran. Well, I'm not an expert on the GCC, but that's not the read that I've had. Certainly, I would agree with you that the Saudi and UAE move to impose this blockade and this challenge against Qatar has backfired as it should have been predicted to do, and that it's forced the Qataris to move closer to the Iranians than what they probably would have intended to do otherwise. It's also created a scenario in which some of the other smaller countries like Kuwait and Oman are also very worried, because if Qatar foils to Saudi and UAE pressure, then Oman and Kuwait are going to be next. In order for them to be able to have their own independent policy, their primary concern right now is not necessarily Iran as much as it is what will a very aggressive Saudi Arabia do to them. And this is happening in the midst of the United States trying to resurrect or trying to create an Arab NATO, again, for the purpose of an all-out containment of Iran. So this is clearly complicated matters for the Trump administration. I think Tillerson and Mattis are very, very frustrated that they actually made some progress in resolving that issue after, I think, a week of shuttle diplomacy, and all of that was just completely destroyed by one single tweet by President Trump taking credit for what the UAE and Saudi Arabia was doing against Qatar. Where exactly that will lead to, I will not be in a position to give you a prediction, but I think it will be next to irreversible, in the sense that I don't think you will have an easy time seeing the type of a united GCC against Iran that existed in years prior to this. The cat's out of the bag, or whatever it's called. It's been clear for some time, as much as many of these countries have problems with Iran, they have been more fearful of a heavy-handed Saudi approach, and that's not clearly out in the open.
Okay, well, I think we've come to our 1 o'clock ending time. There's a lot more, obviously, to discuss about this issue, which, on my calculation, goes back about 4,000 years. But
give and take 200, yeah.
But we have copies for sale of Trita's latest book, Losing an Enemy, and I think you've agreed to sign a few. So it's a crass business. You have to hold up books, but anyway, I think those of you who had the opportunity to be here have the opportunity to get Trita's book, and then you should also get the opportunity to get your blog, which seems to come out like 3 times a day. I don't know how, but I read it all the time, and it's really, I think you're really quite one of the most knowledgeable voices on this very crucial issue. So thank you very much for coming by.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.